All right, I propose we get started. There might still some people that might still join, but they will come in. Good morning. Welcome to this webinar on corporate carbon footprinting and life cycle analysis. Very happy to see that we have again a lot of participants interested in this topic. I'm also very happy that today Carbon+Alt+Delete is not doing this webinar alone, but we have our friends of EcoChain with us. We're very experienced in product carbon footprinting and life cycle analysis. So on the Carbon+Alt+Delete side, me, Kenneth, I will do the talking today. So I'm one of the co-founders of Carbon+Alt+Delete. I'll let Frans Willem introduce himself in a second, but before I do so, maybe just one word on Carbon+Alt+Delete for those who don't know us yet. So we are a software provider focused on corporate carbon footprinting, really corporate carbon footprinting. And we work exclusively with sustainability consultants that use our software to do carbon footprinting for their clients, and then really the end-to-end process from data collection, reporting, insights, facilitating third-party audits. So we are a software company, corporate carbon footprinting, and today we've invited EcoChain and Frans Willem to help us making the link between corporate carbon footprinting and product carbon footprinting. Frans Willem, if you want to introduce yourself and EcoChain, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Kenneth, and welcome everybody to the call. It seems like we have a lot of people on the call, and that's great to see that we have so much interest in this topic, and it's a very exciting topic, as I hopefully can explain to you as well. Yeah, so I'm the CEO of EcoChain. We are also a software company, but we are really focused on the product side of the environmental impact calculation. We were founded already in 2011, so we're quite there already for a long time. And the origin of EcoChain is really in the construction materials, because this is an industry, especially in our region, where the need for this kind of data on the product level is already there for a long time, and therefore also the need for automation and software. Nowadays we operate in more than 20 countries. We have much more than only construction materials. We also look at food, beverage, and a lot more, but I will explain later also in the presentation. We have two tools which I also will explain in this presentation. We have nowadays more than 70 people. Most of us are based in Amsterdam. We also have some people elsewhere. And we focus primarily on B2B supplier, because it is about product data, and manufacturing is our key focus. But we also work together a lot with consultants, because I know a lot of you at the call today are a consultant or in that area. But we also work a lot with partners or consultants, as we call them, to help us on this topic.
Thank you, Frans Willem, for the introduction. Before we dive into the content, just some quick housekeeping rules. So we're very happy to have a very big audience. The downside of that is that it's hard to really interact verbally. So by default, you're muted. You cannot unmute yourself. Your camera is by default switched off, so you can follow the webinar in your pajama. The interaction is going to happen through the chat. So you can use the chat or the QA chat to ask your questions. And then we either get back to them towards the end of the webinar or after the webinar if we don't have enough time, or we also know from previous webinars that often we already can reply to some of your questions over the chat, or maybe some other people here in the call want to answer your question. So don't hesitate, put your questions and comments in the chat, and we'll keep an eye on them. We also have some Carbon+Alt+Delete colleagues who keep an eye on them during this hour. So what is the agenda of today, or why are we doing this? So first of all, it's great to connect with the carbon accounting specialist landscape in Europe. And today in particular, focusing on the topic of corporate carbon footprinting, product carbon footprinting, LCA, we have learned, or we often hear that even rather experienced people are sometimes still a bit confused on the differences and what to use when. So that's why we do this webinar, and that's also why I'm very happy that Frans Willem is here to help me on that, because we're both software companies, but with a slightly different focus and very synergetic, right? So full disclaimer, we don't are partners or we don't have any exclusive relationship, but I would say they're more friends in the ecosystem of carbon experts. So I will start with a very quick introduction just to get the basic definitions right. And then I will explain what we do at Carbon+Alt+Delete for companies that first do their corporate carbon footprint and then need a top-down product carbon footprint. We'll zoom in a bit on the methodology. Second, I will hand over the floor then to Frans Willem, and then he will really explain how they do PCF, how they do LCA, and what the value of companies is of going to the product carbon footprint. That being said, let me dive into the content. A quick introduction to the letter soup, just to make sure that if you're rather new to the topic that you don't get lost. But when we talk about corporate carbon footprint or CCF, we're talking about the total greenhouse gas emissions of an organization, a company, during a certain time period, typically a full year, and throughout its full value chain. So scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. That's CCF. If we talk about PCF, product carbon footprint, that's the product translation of that. So you still look at the greenhouse gas emissions, but you look at the product life cycle really from cradle to grave. So from material extraction to the end of life treatment, and you're going to calculate or map the total greenhouse gas emissions of that product throughout its life cycle. If you talk about life cycle assessments, you go one step deeper than the PCF because you're not only looking at greenhouse gases, but you look at the total environmental impact beyond carbons, also waste, water usage, and so on, of a product, again, through its full life cycle. Right? So CCF, PCF, LCA. Then the big question is when to calculate what or what to calculate when. If you are a company and you're subject to certain regulation like CSRD or SSCR in the UK, it's always about your corporate carbon footprint. If as a company you want to set an overall, you want to develop an overall net zero strategy, a science-based target, an overall mitigation plan, your climate risks as a company, that all starts from your corporate carbon footprint. Then you get to a point where typically you get questions from your suppliers as a company asking about basically a product carbon footprint, right? So if you sell them a certain service and a product, your suppliers or your clients might ask, okay, but what is then the part of your carbon footprint linked to the specific product that I'm sourcing from you? And then you get into the point of a product carbon footprint. If you really start from the product, or if you really go down to the product level and you start thinking about how can I make my products net zero, or even before you have the product in the design phase, you start thinking about circular by design, then you really enter the space of product carbon footprinting and LCA if you look further than just carbon footprinting. What we do at Carbon+Delete is mainly the corporate carbon footprint, and we have a module to calculate top-down the product carbon footprint. What our friends at EcoChain do is very much focused on this product carbon footprint. So you see that we meet a bit on this high-level supplier-specific product carbon footprint, but you will see from the presentation today that we approach this from a completely different angle so that we also address different use cases. I'm going to skip this because we had some technical issues with the Menti. Apologies for that. So we typically like to do a quick survey, but I will not bother you with that. So I will jump straight into the topic from CCF to top-down PCF. So these are a bunch of quotes that we have heard talking to sustainability managers and sometimes even to sustainability consultants. So the first one, my company has never done anything. I got a client asking me for the carbon footprints, so I need an LCA tomorrow, right? Which is, of course, rather ambitious to go from nothing to an LCA overnight. So we still see that in particular companies that are at the start of their sustainability journey are a bit confused by this terminology and get nervous very quickly if they get questions of their big suppliers. and then suddenly think they need a full-blown LCA, while in practice it's kind of a maturity curve that they need to go through, starting with your CCF, then going to PCF, and maybe they don't even need a full-blown LCA because their clients are already interested in the PCF part. The second and the third quote is more than how to approach a product carbon footprint, right? Some people can do it very high level back on the envelope. If you know your corporate carbon footprint, you know your turnover, you divide it to numbers and you have the intensity ratio of your own company, kind of your spend-based emission factor for your company. You sell something for 100 euros, you do the basic math and you end up with a certain number, which is a proxy that is still often used. It can work as a first quick rough estimate, but of course I think you all feel that's very rough and it's not something that you can really take very concrete insights from. We also see sometimes the opposite, that people start to boil the ocean, right? In particular in industries where every product is unique. For instance, in the chemical industry where you make unique mixes of different chemicals. And then you very quickly end up in starting to boil the ocean, where you start to calculate tens of thousands different unique carbon footprints that are all slightly different. But then the question is what to do with it. So I think there is a lot of guidance to be done, also by the sustainability consultants here in the call, to make sure that companies follow the right steps. And this is how we look at it, and also what we do and what we don't do at Carbon+Alt+Delete. So as said, we're really focused on the corporate carbon footprint, and we also really see this as a starting point for almost all companies, because regulation requires it, but also because you cannot run before you walk, right? What we also do is companies that have done their CCF and then need a top-down PCF because their clients are asking for it, that's something that we do. There is typically in the range from 1 to 50 products. If it's really about thousands of products, then you run into the limitations of our approach. What we don't do is really this bottom-up calculation of PCFs. That's really the core strength of companies like EcoChain. And we definitely don't go beyond carbon, so we don't do LCA analysis. So let me take a step back and say 2 slides a bit more theoretically on the link between a corporate carbon footprint and a product carbon footprint. And of course, in our world now, you always go back to the greenhouse gas protocol. So what you see here is probably the most used, well-known figure of the greenhouse gas protocol, explaining the different scopes of a company, of an organization in your corporate carbon footprint. So the corporate carbon footprint, we talk about scopes and we talk about upstream, downstream value chain of the company. If you look at the product carbon footprint, we don't talk about scopes, but we talk about life cycles over the lifetime of the product. From material acquisition, there are 5 of them: material acquisition, production, distribution and storage, use, end of life. Those 2 are linked to each other. So this is the figure where we map, or you can map the scopes, right, which are the columns, with here in this row the different life cycle stages. So if you are a typical production company buying raw materials and then putting them together into a product, this is your figure. So you buy materials from your supplier, so that's the upstream step, typically in your goods and services, 3.1. You're gonna do something with it. That's your production, where you burn gas, you use electricity to convert that product into something, a finished product. And then you have the rest of the life cycle of that product in your scope 3 downstream. So it's distributed to the end client. It might consume or produce emissions in the use phase, and then you have an end of life part to it as well. Then before I will get to quickly showing how we do, but there's one more point that I want to make. It's really on the difference between top down and bottom up. In the end, both approaches give exactly the same mathematical results, but the way that you collect data, the type of data that you start from is different. So I'm not a skater, but I just took this example of a skateboard, where on the left you see really the bottom up approach. So you start from the bill of materials of a product, the skateboard in this example, and you're gonna build it up, and you're gonna say, okay, the one board, that's 5 kilograms of CO2 equivalent. I combine it with 2 trucks, 4 wheels, 8 screws. So I do the math, and then in this example, the carbon footprint of this skateboard is 11 kilograms. They're all dumb numbers, so don't quote me on that. The right-hand side of the slide shows you the top-down approach, where you typically start from a company-wide procurement data, where, for instance, they have bought 100,000 screws, 20,000 boards, and then you're going to allocate them to the different products that you have. So, for instance, maybe the company is selling or producing 10,000 skateboards, and you know that 8 screws per skateboard. So of the 100,000 here, 80,000 screws goes into the skateboards, 20,000 into the snowboards. So you start allocating top down the products to the different, the procurement data to the different products. And then you can also start doing that with your emission data. So if you know that in your corporate carbon footprint, the 100,000 screws corresponded to 100 ton CO2, and that 80% of the screws are being used for your skateboards, you can allocate 80% of the emissions to your skateboards. If you then also divide that to the number of skateboards, you get exactly the same 11 kilogram that you have here. So you end up with the same result, but with a completely different approach. What we do at Carbon+Alt+Delete is the right-hand side. So really the top-down approach, starting from the aggregated data that you have in your corporate carbon footprint. And then you get this relatively easy formula. Voilà, here we are, where you start from your corporate carbon footprint times an allocation key gives you a certain piece of your product carbon footprint. Example here is for the electricity consumption, where let's say company-wide you have 100 ton of emissions for your electricity consumption. You know from your operations department that product A is using 10% of your electricity, product B 15%, product C 35%, product D 40%. So that means that the electricity piece for product A in the production phase of the life cycle is 10 ton CO2, 100 times 10%. And if you do that for all your different products, for all the different activities or data points that you have in your corporate greenhouse gas inventory, you end up with your product carbon footprint top down. And that's the approach that we have, or that we basically are building in Carbon+Alt+Delete, because what I will now show is a feature that is in beta version. So let me go here. Voilà, let me log in again. Here we are. Voilà. So what you see here, it's the development version of Carbon+Alt+Delete, where for those who use Carbon+Alt+Delete, they recognize you have a typical corporate carbon footprint with a corresponding website, with the corresponding dashboard. And then you can start defining different products and different allocation keys. So in this example, I've defined 10 products. The description I've just left empty. And then I also added some business data on the output and the sales. This is important if you then also want to report on your product carbon footprint per euro sales or per ton output. Second piece of information are the allocation keys. So in this example, very simple, I have defined 2 allocation keys. So the electricity key. So based on my electricity consumption, I've identified that those 3 products together use 60% of the electricity, and the other products I've not allocated. And then I also have the sales key. So here, this is basically just saying that every product is representing 10% of my sales. I can then start adding those allocation keys to the different data points that I have in my inventory, right? So here I can say, look, the heating of the office, I'm gonna use the sales key of that to allocate it over my products. It can also be that some of the data points you don't need to allocate, right? For instance, business travel is typically not allocated to your products. And then the results that you will get will be the most interesting piece will basically be this detailed Excel extract where you get an overview of your different products, their emissions divided over the different allocation keys. And then you can also zoom in and click through. So let's say product one, my production. I want to see what's behind this 188 ton. And then you get back to the different lines in your corporate carbon footprint. So that way it's really top down. You start your products, you have your allocation keys. We calculate your product emissions per product, per life cycle stage. And if you then click or zoom in, you go back to the underlying data points in your corporate carbon footprint. So this is what we do at Carbon+Alt+Delete, how we look at corporate carbon footprinting and deriving top-down a product carbon footprinting from there. I've also made it clear that that's where we stop. So we don't do a PCF bottom-up, we don't do LCA, and that's where EcoChain comes in. So Franz Willem, with this, happy to give you the floor. I will stop sharing so that you can start sharing and take control of the slides. And it seems like we're perfect on time, so that's very good. Go ahead, Franz
Super,
Willem.
Kenneth. Thanks so much, and again, thanks also for inviting us to this call. Anyway, I'll try to first. I have the challenge, of course, of now doing the sharing. Oh, 1 sec. Am I sharing now?
Yes, on full screen, all clear.
Good.
Go ahead.
Good. All right, so little agenda. So I will hook up until where I kind of left it and look more from a bottom-up perspective. By the way, but I will also explain how that works. We also have an in-between one because we actually have two solutions, and I will go into the detail in a few minutes. But we also have a top-down. The difference with what Carbon+Alt+Delete is doing is that we do that on a factory level, because sometimes that's also relevant, and we do it on an LCA, from an LCA perspective. So we also have two ways of looking at it. Clearly the bottom up, and I think that's also what Kenneth is showing, is the main difference, of course, is that and the main benefit is that you can do it at scale, right? You can instantly calculate the impact of 5,000 or 10,000 products. And if that is relevant for our customer or for your customer, then that is definitely applicable. So I will quickly go a little bit through what it is and where we're coming from. I have also a couple of cases and also some market dynamics I wanted to share, which may be relevant for you also when looking at this topic. So product footprinting, why it matters and ways to do it. To start with that, I very often start with the story about a company called Interface. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this. It's quite a famous story, actually. On the right-hand side, you see a guy called Ray Anderson. Ray was the CEO of the company, also the founder of the company. They make carpet tiles. And the interesting part of this story is, and there's a fantastic documentary about it called Beyond Zero, but the interesting thing is that it actually exactly explains what also Kenneth already said in terms of the journey of a customer, because that's how you have to look at it. And the interesting part of this one is, why I also would like to use it, is that they already, and that was, I think, the benefit, is that already Ray in 1992 said, guys, what we're doing is not sustainable. We need to change. And he basically pushed the organization to come with a target, to say, guys, if we want to change, what is the impact we have as a company? What is the target we want to set ourselves? A net zero target, which again in 1992 was quite innovative. And then they started the journey. So what is the impact we have as a company? What target do we set? And then, of course, because they are a product company, they very quickly realized that the impact, of course, they have is in their products. And that's what we are talking about today. At the end, if you're a product company, if you're a manufacturer, 90% of your impact is in your products. Therefore, you need to understand the impact. And if you then look at their journey, they also started, first of all, with looking really at efficiency. So cutting loss, waste, looking at waste and all these kind of things. And they could actually create quite a saving already by looking at that, but not touching the product as it was. But they also realized, of course, at a certain point, we don't get further than this. And we also need to look at the innovation of the product. We need to understand, what does the product consist of? Where is the impact coming from? And how can we change that? And All of that work, again, great documentary, led to a net zero of interface in 2020. But the target they set themselves was in 2000, which also shows, in my view, how difficult it is if you really want to get serious about it. The movie, to finalize that, it is called Beyond Zero, also because they are actually now also working on carpet tiles that take CO2 instead of delivering CO2 or putting it in the atmosphere. Same picture, but then from a well-known research company, same thing, right? If you look at the maturity in terms of sustainable development, you start, of course, with compliance. Do I adhere to all the rules and regulations? And what is the impact I have as a company? What targets do I set myself? And again, if you're a product company, you start to look at products. As said, products determine up to 96%, but more than 90% of the total impact of a manufacturer or a product brand is coming from products. That means that is what they have to look at. What is also a very interesting number to understand is that 80% of the impact of a product is determined in the design phase. So how much energy it consumes in the use phase, how it's produced, what materials are used. All of that is determined ultimately in the design phase, and it starts with understanding. To measure is to know, right? What that impact is and how you can change these impact categories, which is something Carbon+Alt+Delete does from their perspective, and we do from a bottom-up perspective. But ultimately, it needs to lead to how can we change? What is also relevant in this whole topic is that if you're a product company, you will see that 70-80% of that impact is coming from your supply chain, right? Basically, the goods and materials you buy to create your products. If you look at, we work with Unilever. I will show you a small case in that as well. We work with Unilever, for instance. They have calculated that 76% of the total impact of Unilever, including their sales officers, everything, is coming from their supply chain. And that data is very hard to get. That is not available. And what you now actually see is that there's a push on the market to get that data, and therefore on the suppliers who then struggle with providing PCFs or LCAs. So that's the whole market we're in. Very, very quick on life cycles assessment, because also Kenneth already went into that. So again, we are talking about a product life cycle, right? From raw materials, transport, up until end of life. And how I always try to explain it in terms of what is an LCA versus a PCF, or maybe sometimes heard also of EPDs, is that an LCA is a methodology. It's a worldwide used standard. I think it's the worldwide accepted standard for calculating the impact of a product. It is high ISO certified, ISO certification on it, 4040, 44, 4667, which is the PCF version. And LCA basically looks at several impact categories. Carbon is the most known one, but there are also impact from water, landfill, and all of these toxicity, all of these kind of categories, which are all well described in let's say LCA as a methodology. And then if with that methodology you can basically create several outcomes, right? So if you only look at the carbon part, simplified, that you would look at a PCF. If you would look, if your customer or supplier requires an LCA, you would probably create an LCA report. In construction materials, it's very well in the EPDs, which is a product declaration, is the most used version of an LCA. But the point I want to make is that an LCA is, in that sense, from a bottom-up perspective, always the methodology to use, and then the outcomes can be different depending on industry or request. Challenges of a LCA or PCF is that it's that, let's say, an LCA exists already for a long time. It's already since the 60s of the last century, and typically, because a company would get maybe 1 or 2 questions on an LCA or a PCF per year, they would go to an external consultant, and then this consultant would create a report and that report would typically cost 15 to 20,000 euros. That is, if you get this request once a year, is let's say an affordable cost. The problem is that the requests for PCF and LCA is now rapidly increasing, and this therefore becomes a very expensive thing to do. Plus, if you talk about eco-design, which is an element of course, looking or understanding the impact of a product, this is not very flexible because you have to go back and forth. So you can understand that there is a need to change this. The other challenge in the market is that a lot of the LCA tools available are made for specialists, and there's nothing wrong with that because and there are very capable people doing that. But the problem is that while the need for LCA and PCF is increasing, also the need for getting this in-house and understanding this from a company perspective is also increasing, and therefore people who we call business users or non-experts want to start working with LCAs and PCF and get the understanding themselves. And therefore, there is a need for software which basically makes it easier for them or easier for the consultants helping them to work on this topic. And that's our vision as EcoChain, is that we want to create, and we have created, business software for non-experts. We have two tools. So this is what we also call a top-down approach. And the difference with what Kenneth just explained is that we do sort of the same. We look with this tool, we look at a factory. So we're not looking at company level, but at factory level. And we say everything that goes into a factory, what happens in the factory in terms of processes, and then the output of that specific factory determines then the impact per product coming out of that factory. And clearly, the benefit of this tooling is that you create LCAs or PCFs at scale. We have more than 200 customers using this software and have rolled this out over multiple factories around the world. I'm not going to demonstrate it because it's because of the sake of time, but if you're more interested to see more of this, we can always organize it. The other tool we have is called Mobius. This is really a bottom-up tool. So this is really looking at a bill of materials, simplified bill of materials, look at the impact of all the components of a bill of materials, and start to understand where can we change it. This is a tool where you can really look at what-if scenarios. What if I change the electricity mix? What if I change a certain raw material in my product? What if I change, etc., and compare these products and create an iterative process of how to basically get at the end to a better product from a sustainability or environmental perspective. So to give you a little bit more light on how that would work, I give you a couple of practical use cases. First one is about B. Braun. It's a very large German medical supply company. They make syringes and infusion bags and these kind of things. And they had exactly this problem I already described. So they were getting at that time maybe one or two questions from hospitals about a product they provided. But they saw the need for LCA in this case going up, and of course, therefore also their cost. And they they piloted with us, and they in the pilot they compared basically an LCA created by a consultant, which costed them 15,000 euros, to basically looking at a syringe factory where around 600 syringes were coming out. Different kinds of syringes, about to create the impact of all of these, or to call the LCAs of all of these syringes coming out of the factory. And that led to a significant cost reduction, as you can imagine. But what was also important for them, as they are a medical company, of course, is that also the accuracy is still there, right? And they compared, therefore, the LCA created by the consultant versus ours. And the difference was actually less than 3%, which basically led to their decision to move on with this. They use both our tools, so they use Helix for their factories, also maybe good to understand, and they use Mobius at their R&D department, really looking at innovation and designing the next products in their space. So that's one example. The other one is a company called Zero Packaging. They were creating packaging, environmental of low impact packaging for Vodafone. That was their challenge. And they used Mobius in this case to really do the eco design, understand what is the impact, and then gradually, iteratively changing the impact of the product. And the third use case, which is a different one, which I already mentioned in terms of Unilever. So here you look at a company that says, okay, 76% of my total impact comes from my supply chain. How do I work together with my suppliers to get that data? And we created with them together a program to basically provide them with software, training, and support to the suppliers to make sure that the suppliers can provide PCFs in this case to Unilever. And we also used there the Pact Pathfinder methodology, which was a requirement from Unilever, which is a certain standard of a PCF, which is now sort of gradually getting adapted by especially the FMCG and the food market. One slide on market dynamics. So I would say traditionally, a lot of the demand in LCA, PCF, EPD has been driven by specific regulation, public tenders. I mentioned already construction materials, where this is already, I would say, mainstream for a long time, but you see now also in other industries like health where this is happening. That's a key driver and will continue to be a big driver for this need. But what we also now see coming is that CSRD, so company footprinting, and the realization that Scope 3 data is basically and specific cost Scope 3 data, so supplier data is missing, is driving also the need for LCAs, PCFs from a supplier perspective. If suppliers understand that, and if they have typically multiple customers asking for this, they also start to understand the need for scale. And that's where I think also Kenneth with Carbon+Alt+Delete comes in, where we come in, because companies start to look for how do I, at the end, manage the impact and the reporting impact, report the impact of the products I provide. And typically these companies have large portfolios. So that is one. They are looking, of course, at software solutions to automate it, and that's why we are in this market. But I also would like to say that I think, and what we always try to say is that at the end, it's not a simple thing, right? So even if there are software solutions out there, there is a need to support clients in getting through the complexity, to help them, educate them, help them in terms of integration, data collection. There's a lot of complexity around this topic, and I believe, and I'm putting it as an opportunity for especially everybody here on the call, being a consultant, there's a huge opportunity also here to help customers getting this job done. So for consultant special slide, it's complex. Therefore, I believe that there is a big role for people that can help customers in data collection, modeling, and reporting. There's a rising demand. I'm not sure, but I'm guessing that you are seeing the same. And I do think that from a consultant perspective, having this knowledge and be able to understand also and guide customers through this whole landscape is absolutely a competitive advantage you can create. Now, how can we support? We have, of course, the tooling, as I already explained, and we can always demo that in a better way. But we can also, of course, we have also people on board that can help you or can help, especially in the beginning, to make this happen. If you're interested in this, on the right-hand side, our partnership manager, Irem, can give you a lot of information. There's her email address. And if that is not the question, but you have other questions, then you can always approach me through these details. I think we are going to share the presentation afterwards, so you will get the details then, and you can always approach us to get more questions. I see a hand raised already. Kenneth, shall I give it back to you? What you want?
Yes. Thanks a lot, Frans Willem, for this. You can just stop sharing.
I'll do.
So
yeah.
We have seen already a lot of the questions coming in through the chat. So I would still invite people to ask their questions in the chat. We also have already answered some of them, but there are still some unanswered. Maybe two questions to you, Franz Willem, that I saw popping up.
Yeah.
One is on the construction industry and the use of EcoChain in the construction industry. Can you say a couple of words on what you do there and your experiences, particularly with that industry?
Yeah. Yeah, so construction materials, because it's construction materials industry we're focused on, and so the manufacturers in that space. Typically, these customers have, let's say, large portfolios of sort of similar kind of products, right? So we think about plastic pipes, think about bricks, think about asphalt, think about or concrete. Tarmac, I should say in English. So, concrete, and these factories produce this in large quantities, and they have often a big mix of variations of the same product. And so there we typically use our top-down approach, where we basically say, okay, let's look at a asphalt or a Tarmac factory. They have maybe 10,000 mixtures, and the problem with the Tarmac guys is, or the asphalt guys, is that they have to provide this data on a mixture level to the customers they provide it to. So usually in public tenders, roadworks, infrastructure, as you can see, they have to provide it on a product level. And the other problem they have is that it also needs to be verified, right? So and that is also a very costly exercise. So what we provide with, in this case, Helix, is that we create this EPD or LCA at scale. So we can create basically a footprint inside of every product. And by the way, if you change, for instance, the electricity mix of the factory, automatically the impact of all the products also change. But you can also then get the whole system verified. So that is also an advantage for the customers, because then they get an LCA at a much lower cost level. And for the Tarmac guys, we can go back down to 2-3 euros per LCA, and that is a very important topic for them. But you can also verify it on a system level. So also the verification, so the stamp basically from a third party saying you have done it correctly, is also important. Oh, is that clear, Kev?
It's clear for me. If not, I'll keep an eye on the chat. There was a second question for you, Franz Willem, which I liked. It was more on CBAM and the potential regulatory drive from CBAM to also have product carbon footprints. And then the question, who needs to do it? Is it the importer or the exporter? Do you see how do you look at CBAM from an EcoChain or PCF point of view?
Yeah, so CBAM, which is about putting a carbon tax on products which are imported, in this case in the EU. Well, at the end, you have to basically prove, and you have to show what the impact of a particular product that you want to import into the EU is, right? And also there, an LCA is the accepted methodology, or a PCF is the accepted methodology to calculate this. So that I would say, so yeah, it's very relevant. What you see maybe on a more broader scale, what you see happening is that is that ultimately, I think companies that produce products need to understand the impact of their products, and they have to use it from a supplier perspective. They may want to use it because they want data from their suppliers. They need it maybe from a CBAM perspective. They need it for other regulatory perspectives. But I think at the end, companies more and more realize that somehow they need to get this data under control. And I think the top-down approach, kind of also from your side, I think is a fantastic, good approach. And especially if you want to do quickly large quantities, But very often and more, there is a specific level of data required, and then you also need to look at the bottom up side. So that's where all these things come together, and why they're equally important to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks a lot for that. Then there was another question that got quite a bit of likes. What was on the link between PCF and CCF? So let me quickly go back to
Yeah.
this slide. So
Yeah.
there was a question, and then I can give our answer. You can add, Franz Wilm, if you
Yeah.
disagree. So the question was, if you really calculate the PCF of all products of a company and then you sum them up, is it always exactly the same as the CCF? So the question is no, it can be, but it's typically not. Why is that? So if you look at the CCF, the corporate carbon footprint of the 21 activities that the greenhouse gas protocol defines, if you then look at the product protocol of the greenhouse gas protocol, you should only allocate 16 of those 21 to your products. So what is not allocated is business travel, employee commuting, waste, not end of life, but waste in operations of the producing company, leased assets, investments, and franchises. And then the leased assets, both upstream and downstream. So actually, it are 6 that you can exclude. Sorry, 7 that you can exclude, 14 that you need to take into account. So that's why typically, if you sum up the PCFs, you end up with a lower number than the CCFs. It's not forbidden to include those, right? So you can include and allocate your business travel into your PCF, but it's not required by the greenhouse gas protocol. The other way around, important. There are a lot of companies that don't really do a full Scope 3 corporate carbon footprint yet, and that, for instance, stop at the distribution part and don't really look yet at the end of life and use of their value chain. Of course, if you start from an incomplete corporate carbon footprint and then you do look at the full value chain of all your products, the sum of your product carbon footprints might be higher than your CCF, right? So that's the nuance there. Another question that often popped up in the chat is on emission factors that can be used for this. I think everything that we explained here is a bit regardless of the exact emission factors that you use. We in Carbon+Alt+Delete have various sets of emission factors from UK Gov, ADEM, UBA, down to spend-based emission factors like Exio-base, but also Eco-Invent do we have. I don't know, Frans Willem, anything you want to add on this question, also on the question of emission factors from your side?
No, I think your explanation on, the difference between the CCF and the PCF, I think is very clear, right? So there is a difference, right? Because the product view is you purely look at the product. I want to maybe add is that what you see now happening a lot is that in this Scope 3 upstream, right? So asking your suppliers for data, you see a lot of companies now asking for the CCF actually from a company, which is understandable because it's easier, and often companies are a bit further ahead on that side than be able to deliver a PCF on a product level. But it is a bit strange on the other hand, because basically if you ask if you need data from your supplier, you basically buy products from them. You don't buy a company from them, right? So it is again it's a good step because it's easier, and therefore it gives you already insights of the impact of your products and where to focus on, because it creates a hotspot analysis. But at the end, it's not the end part, because you at the end you need the data from the products you buy. I think that's what I would like to add.
Absolutely, absolutely. And at the same time, I'm also looking at the chat. There is a question from a person on more cradle to gate and cradle to grave, right? And it's indeed something that we didn't discuss in detail, but it's an important concept. So if you look at the CCF and the PCF, I think it's just important that the boundaries are in line, so that if you only do your Scope 1 and 2 and your upstream corporate carbon footprint, so only this part, And then you start allocating that to products. By definition, you have a cradle to gate product carbon footprint, where the gate is basically up and including the production phase. You definitely don't have a cradle to grave. So I think if you, in particular, if you advise companies also on how to report on that, I think it's very important that you explain them the difference between cradle to gate and cradle to grave, and that you also advise them to, in their communication to stakeholders, be very clear on whether it's a full life cycle, cradle to grave, or a partial cradle to gate, or even gate to gate product carbon footprint.
Yep.
From your experience, Francois, any
Yeah. So
advice
what you
on how
see
to
is
deal
that
with this nuance?
yeah, so yeah, great explanation. I think the what you see in the market is that, especially in the value chain, and it's logical. A lot of the, let's say, suppliers calculate to gate, right? So to when the product leaves the factory gate. And why? Because yeah, otherwise you start counting the use phase double, right? If they also start taking the use case in phase into account. So what you typically see is that in the supply chain, the suppliers work with a to gate kind of analysis. But then when you get closer to the consumer or to the end customer, it becomes the end of life becomes also, or use and end of life becomes more important. So, I always use the example. We have Philips, for instance, as a customer. Philips has hair dryers, right? And for Philips, as the impact of a hair dryer is for 80% in the use phase, which is basically the electricity consumption of the hair dryer. Which is important information for Philips, because that means that they can have a huge impact in the design phase, as coming the design phase back in, for instance, designing a more energy efficient engine for the hair dryer. And so for Philips, the use and the end of life, so how is it disposed? And actually, by the way, there's now a lot of regulation also in Europe around this topic. The Eco Design Directive, which basically says that if you are a producer of products, you also have a responsibility in the use and end of life, and the right of repair and all these kind of things come there. But it depends a bit on where you are in the value chain, if this is relevant or not. Because if you're, for instance, a chemical company and you provide raw materials to others, the use and end of life is typically not included.
Absolutely. In the interest of time, I propose we stop the Q&A here. We have not been able to answer all questions. So what we will do is we will go again through all the questions in the chat. If they're not yet answered, we will get back to you on those points. There were also some questions more related to, let's say, the commercial part, like a demo, pricing, and so on. For those, on purpose, we have not addressed them because we like to focus really on the content here, but we will share together with the recordings and the slides also the contact details, both from people at Carbon+Delete as from Frans Willem and his team. So feel free to reach out to us or to Frans Willem directly to follow up on those aspects. And I very much like the comment of the person saying that we should change this figure, because if those are carbon emissions, we're all aiming to get here. So this is where we should be, right? So we will update this slide going forward. I like that a lot. All jokes aside, maybe 2 final slides before we let you go. A bit of publicity on our site. For those who have joined webinars before, they know that we don't do this one-off. We do kind of a recurring series of webinars on topics related to carbon footprinting, carbon accounting. So the next webinar is already planned. It will be on April 24 on the topic of limited assurance or further verification. So that's also a topic that we often discuss with sustainability consultants. So we will zoom in on that. You can either scan the QR code if you haven't done so, or we'll share the link through the emailing as well. Let me quickly also put it in the chat. The second thing I wanted to leave you with is on the carbon community. So we see that we're all living in a changing world, different nuances in different protocols. So we have set up basically an online Q&A forum that you can use for free, and where you can connect with your peers. So a bit what you've seen today in the chat, where different people ask questions and answer each other's questions. That's what we organize here on this community.carbon.delete.eu. So I would also invite you to have a look at it, and if it helps you in your daily life, feel free to use it as well. So with that, I think we can stop on the hour. Thanks a lot for joining. Thanks a lot for the interactions through the chat. Franz Willem, thanks a lot for contributing to this webinar.
Yeah, thanks a lot for inviting me.
We will be in touch with all of you over email, and we wish you a very happy and pleasant rest of the day. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye-bye.